It is 7 o'clock on the morning of December the 2nd, 1805. An icy fog, as dense and white as a burial shroud, clings to the earth, muffling all sound and devouring the Moravian landscape. Atop a hill, a lone silhouette is defined against the grayish gloom. It is Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. His marshals, men forged in the fire of a dozen campaigns, move with a visible restlessness around him. They observe their own battle line, stretched to the breaking point, its right flank, dangerously weakened and exposed. It looks like an army on the verge of retreat, an exhausted force poised for collapse. But the emperor is not looking at his men, nor even at the heights where the enemy's might is gathering. His eyes are fixed on a strategic point he has deliberately left empty, the vast and dominant Pratzen Heights. The tension in the air is almost unbearable, a mixture of biting cold and the imminence of a colossal-scale slaughter. Every French general feels the weight of the 90,000 Russian and Austrian soldiers observing them from the high ground, a tide of bayonets and cannons ready to sweep them from the map. Military logic dictates that their position is indefensible, a tactical suicide. They are outnumbered. Their supply line is dangerously extended, and they seem to have ceded the most crucial ground without a fight. The enemy commanders, confident in their overwhelming advantage, see in the French disposition the confirmation of their own propaganda. Napoleon is weakened, fearful, and ready to flee. Their arrogance is a poison that clouds their judgment, leading them to believe that victory already belongs to them before the first shot is fired. Amidst the anxiety of his staff, Napoleon's calm is unnatural, almost divine. There is no trace of doubt in his countenance, only a predatory patience, that of a hunter who has laid his trap with mathematical precision and now merely waits for the prey to make the final false step. He does not await a report from his scouts or a message from his spies. His gaze is directed eastward, waiting for his true accomplice in this audacious theater of war. He knows that the success of his plan depends not only on the discipline of his veterans or the genius of his marshals. The final actor in his masterpiece, the element that will unleash hell upon his enemies, is neither a man nor a cannon. The emperor is waiting for the signal of a silent, celestial ally. Napoleon has turned the battlefield into a three-dimensional chessboard, and every move he has made thus far, every feigned retreat, every calculated show of weakness, has been designed for a single purpose: to manipulate the minds of his adversaries. He has offered them the most irresistible bait for a confident army, the chance for a glorious and definitive finishing blow. He has emptied the center of his power, the Pratzen Heights, knowing that the temptation to occupy it to crush his fragile right flank would be an invitation that the young and ambitious Tsar Alexander I could not refuse. On this frozen dawn, the fate of Europe hangs not on brute force, but on the exact moment when the light will tear through the veil of fog. The sun is the final piece in this perfect and lethal orchestration. The force looming over the French army was a true colossus, a glacier of steel and ambition, representing the combined power of two of Europe's oldest empires. Nearly 90,000 soldiers, an overwhelming numerical superiority, formed the ranks of the Third Coalition Army. They were an amalgam of Austrian regiments, disciplined and steadfast in the defense of their ancestral homeland, and the vast columns of the Imperial Russian Army, soldiers known for their incredible endurance and fanatical loyalty to their sovereign. In their ranks marched some of the most illustrious names of European military aristocracy, men who considered Napoleon an upstart, a vulgar product of the revolution who threatened to subvert the natural order of the world. Their confidence was based not only on numbers, but on a profound disdain for their opponent. At the head of this formidable war machine stood two emperors, whose contrasting personalities sowed the seeds of their own destruction. Emperor Francis II of Austria, a cautious man aware of Napoleon's capabilities after previous defeats, was constantly overshadowed by the dominant presence of his young ally, Tsar Alexander the Red of Russia. Alexander was the personification of imperial arrogance, impetuous, vain, and blinded by an insatiable thirst for personal glory. He saw this battle not as a complex tactical problem, but as his personal coronation on the European stage, the opportunity to humiliate the Corsican ogre and establish himself as the savior of the continent. This vanity made him deaf to the only voice of reason in his war council. That voice belonged to General Mikhail Kutuzov, the true commander-in-chief of the Allied forces. A seasoned, cunning veteran, deeply suspicious of Napoleon's apparent weakness, Kutuzov pleaded for caution. He understood that Napoleon was a master of deception and that the French position was too vulnerable to be genuine. He smelled a trap. He repeatedly warned the Tsar not to abandon the secure heights of the Pratzen Plateau, not to be lured by the temptation of a hasty attack. However, his warnings were dismissed with contempt by Alexander and his circle of young nobles, who accused the old general of cowardice. Prudence was branded as fear, and experience was silenced by the clamor of youthful ambition. The fatal flaw of the coalition army was not, therefore, a weakness in its composition or its weaponry, but a deliberate psychological blindness. They were so convinced of their own superiority and of Napoleon's desperation that they interpreted his every move through the lens of their own desires. The deliberate weakening of the French right flank was not seen as bait, but as irrefutable, proof that the French army was on the verge of collapse. The evacuation of the Pratzen Heights was not analyzed as a stratagem, but as a mistake by a commander who had lost his nerve. Believing absolutely that victory was a ripe fruit ready to be harvested, they abandoned all precaution and plunged headlong into the most obvious baited trap in military history. In stark contrast to the multinational giant opposing it, the army waiting in the valley was an entity forged with a singular purpose and an unshakable loyalty to one man. The Grande Armée, with approximately 73,000 men, was numerically inferior, but qualitatively superior in almost every aspect. They were not anonymous conscripts fighting for distant monarchs. They were citizens of a new empire, veterans hardened by a decade of relentless campaigns from the sands of Egypt to the plains of Italy. Every soldier, from the tallest grenadier to the youngest gunner, felt a personal bond with their emperor. Napoleon was not just their commander. He was the living symbol of France's glory, the man who had promised them that skill and courage, not birthright, were the true path to honor. Napoleon himself projected a facade of weakness and desperation, a calculated performance for his enemies, but internally, he was a predator at the height of his power. His confidence did not stem from arrogance, but from the mathematical certainty of his plan and his absolute faith in the ability of his men. He felt the immense pressure on his shoulders. This battle was an existential gamble. A defeat at Austerlitz would not simply mean the loss of a battle, but the collapse of his entire imperial system. The Third Coalition, financed by British gold, would pounce on a vulnerable France, dismantling his conquests and ending his hegemony in Central Europe. Everything he had fought for, the dream of a continent united under his law and his vision, would turn to ashes. The motivation of the Grande Armée was, therefore, visceral and direct: survival. They were not fighting for an abstract concept of balance of power, but for the defense of their revolution, for the glory of their nation, and above all, for the man who led them. Napoleon had cultivated a mystique of invincibility, but also a deep sense of camaraderie. He knew his marshals intimately, understood the character of each regiment, and knew exactly how much he could demand of them. This cohesion, this unity of purpose from the emperor down to the last infantryman, made the Grande Armée a far sharper and more lethal weapon than the cumbersome and divided war machine of the coalition. They were a closed fist, ready to strike with concentrated and devastating force. Thus, in the fog of Austerlitz, the stage presented a classic drama. On one side, a powerful but clumsy giant, led by vanity and internal discord, convinced that its weight alone would guarantee victory. On the other, a smaller, faster, and smarter challenger, united by a common cause and led by the greatest military genius of his era. The French cause was that of a new order fighting for its existence against the ancient monarchies of Europe. It was the cause of ambition, meritocracy, and national glory against tradition, privilege, and divine right. The battle about to begin would not be just a clash of armies, but a fundamental collision between two worlds. Now the board is set. The giant, blinded by pride, has begun its fatal descent, abandoning the ground that guaranteed it victory. The challenger, a master of deception, waits patiently for the precise moment to snap his trap shut. You can feel the tension, the moment suspended in time before history is written in blood and steel. This transformation of a battlefield into a work of tactical art, this duel of intellects where psychology is the deadliest weapon, is precisely the kind of story we resurrect on this channel. We unearth the strategies, the emotions, and the crucial moments that decided the fate of empires and forged the legends that echo to this day, demonstrating how the mind of a single man could overcome impossible odds. If you want to witness how Napoleon turned his enemies' arrogance into the instrument of their own annihilation, if you want to understand in detail the brilliance of the Austerlitz trap and see how one of the most perfect battles in history unfolded, we invite you to join our legion. Subscribe now and activate notifications so you don't miss a single moment of this and other epic confrontations that defined our world. Your support is the fuel that allows us to march through the annals of time and bring these incredible stories of genius, sacrifice, and glory back to life. Hit like if you are ready to see how 70,000 men outwitted 90,000. Napoleon's secret hope, the key that would transform a desperate defense into an annihilating offensive, was not a new weapon, nor a hidden battalion, but an idea. An idea based on a profound understanding of geography and a flawless reading of his opponent's psychology. His masterpiece of deception was the perfect trap, a strategy of such astonishing audacity that his enemies were incapable of conceiving it. The plan began with the most counterintuitive decision to deliberately cede the most valuable ground on the battlefield, the Pratzen Heights. He knew that for a leadership as arrogant as the coalition's, occupying those dominant heights would not be seen as an option, but as a right, an obvious and crushing step toward victory. To make the bait even more irresistible, Napoleon intentionally weakened his right flank under Marshal Davout, stretching it to a point that any military manual would consider madness. This apparent vulnerability was an open invitation, a giant sign that screamed, "Attack here!" The goal was to draw the main mass of the Allied army, its left wing and center, into a massive offensive against this weak point. In doing so, he would force them to descend from the Pratzen Heights, to abandon their position of power, and to stretch their own lines across the valley and its streams. Napoleon was, in essence, tempting his enemies to dismantle their own command structure and tactical cohesion in the pursuit of a finishing blow. The true genius of the plan lay in what the enemy could not see. Concealed by the thick morning fog and the folds of the terrain at the very base of the plateau, Napoleon had secretly positioned his army's main strike force. The IV Army Corps, commanded by the formidable Marshal Soult and composed of 20,000 of his finest infantrymen, waited in absolute silence. They were completely invisible to Allied scouts and to the generals observing from the heights. This force was not there to defend, but to attack. They were a hidden dagger, aimed directly at the enemy's exposed heart, waiting for the signal to ascend and seize control of the battlefield. This strategy, known as the weak center maneuver, was a gamble of monumental risk. It required perfect timing, an unwavering faith in the ability of Davout's right flank to withstand an attack by overwhelmingly superior forces for long enough, and an absolute confidence that the enemy would act exactly as he had predicted. Napoleon was not just moving troops. He was orchestrating the arrogance of Tsar Alexander. He was counting on his rival's impetuousness to prevail over the caution of his more experienced generals. He was betting the fate of his empire on his ability to predict and manipulate the vanity of a single man, turning the battlefield itself into his chief accomplice. The preparation of the ground was meticulous. Napoleon had studied every hill, every stream, and every path of Austerlitz for days. He knew that the frozen lakes and marshes to the south of the battlefield, near the village of Telnitz, would seem like a viable escape route for the Allied left wing once the trap was sprung. In his mind, however, these lakes were not an exit, but the final act of the slaughter. Geography, in Napoleon's hands, ceased to be a passive backdrop and became an active, lethal character in the drama that was about to unfold. The stage was set for the impossible to become not just possible, but inevitable. The gambit was a symphony of deception. By pretending to be on the defensive, by pleading for peace in the preceding days, and by displaying a seemingly demoralized army, Napoleon had constructed a narrative of weakness that the Allies were all too eager to believe. Every piece of intelligence they received confirmed their prejudices. They did not realize they were reading not the signs of Napoleon's desperation, but the pages of the script he himself had written for them. The secret hope was not just a tactic. It was the conviction that the mind of a general, when used with the precision of a scalpel, is the most devastating weapon in any arsenal. The moments preceding the first clash of arms were charged with a palpable atmosphere, though radically different in each camp. On the Pratzen Heights, among the coalition headquarters, the air vibrated with a noisy confidence and an almost festive anticipation. Young Russian officers, dressed in their most opulent uniforms, joked about Napoleon's imminent capture and toasted to the glory that awaited them. Tsar Alexander, surrounded by his fawning retinue, surveyed the fog-shrouded valley not as a general studying a tactical problem, but as a monarch contemplating the stage of his preordained triumph. Victory seemed so certain that the only real concern was how to divide the spoils and the glory. The disdain for the enemy was absolute. On the opposite side, in the fog-enveloped French lines, a grim and resolute silence reigned. There were no cheers or boasts, only the quiet efficiency of a veteran army preparing for battle. The soldiers of the Grande Armée, huddled around their small fires, checked their muskets, sharpened their bayonets, and shared rations in an almost ritualistic silence. They knew their emperor. They knew that his apparent inferiority often concealed a strike of unimaginable violence and speed. There was an implicit faith in his genius, a quiet confidence that, despite the odds, they would be shown the path to victory. Their determination was not loud, but a quiet, lethal force, the calm of a predator about to spring. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the dense layer of fog, the difference between the two armies became even more apparent. The movement of the Allied columns descending from the plateau was heavy, noisy, and somewhat disorganized, the march of a force that believes the enemy is already defeated and only the task of sweeping up its remnants remains. It was the movement of a giant confident in its own weight. In the valley, the French army remained almost motionless, an organism barely breathing in the gloom, each unit in its exact position, awaiting the word of a single man. It was the stillness of a coiled cobra, conserving every ounce of energy for the decisive strike that would decide everything. It is 8 o'clock in the morning. The coalition's war machine lurches into motion with an unstoppable inertia, exactly as Napoleon had foreseen. Nearly half of their army, more than 40,000 men, begins the slow, lumbering descent from the Pratzen Heights. Their objective is clear and, in their minds, simple: to crush the seemingly weak and overstretched French right flank in the south, near the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz. It is a tide of infantry and artillery advancing with the arrogant certainty of its power. General Kutuzov, observing the massive troop displacement that was emptying the center of his own line, vehemently protests one last time. "We are emptying the center," he desperately warns the Tsar, but Alexander, drunk on the vision of glory, ignores him completely. The trap has been sprung. The first impact of the Allied attack falls upon the meager forces of Marshal Davout. His men, the soldiers of the Third Army Corps, are a legend within a legend. They have completed a forced march of 110 kilometers in less than 48 hours, arriving on the battlefield at the last possible moment, exhausted but with their spirits unbroken. Now, outnumbered by a ratio of almost 3-1, they face the impossible task of containing the avalanche. The fighting in the southern villages instantly becomes a hell of close-range musket fire, bayonet charges, and desperate house-to-house combat. Every inch of ground is paid for with a terrible price in blood and lives. The resistance of the French right flank is superhuman, a calculated act of heroism that defies all military logic. Davout, a master of tenacious defense, uses the terrain to perfection, turning every stream, every building, and every vineyard into a makeshift fortress. His men fight with the ferocity of the desperate, knowing their sole mission is to hold on. They do not need to win. They only need to win time. Every minute they hold the massive Allied columns at bay is another minute Napoleon needs for the enemy's center to be completely emptied. The Allied generals, frustrated by the unexpected French tenacity, commit more and more troops to the fight, falling deeper into the trap. While the battle rages in the south, the center of the battlefield, the strategic Pratzen Heights, becomes increasingly unguarded. The Yamburina, Allied columns, in their eagerness to join the main assault, move away from the high ground, leaving only a token garrison behind. They see no danger, for they still believe the French army is entirely focused on its struggle for survival in the south. The fog still clinging to the slopes of the plateau conceals the truth, acting as a silent accomplice in Napoleon's plan. The attention of the entire coalition high command is fixed on the bait, completely oblivious to the dagger that is about to be plunged into their back. The first phase of Napoleon's plan has been completed to perfection. The tenacity of Davout's troops in the south is the hinge upon which the entire battle turns. Their heroic resistance not only buys precious time, but also feeds the arrogance of the Allied command. Every French regiment that holds firm against impossible odds is seen by Tsar Alexander not as a sign of elite discipline, but as the last gasp of a dying army. This misperception leads them to make their most critical error. Instead of pausing and reassessing the situation, the coalition commanders double down on their bet, sending even more battalions southward to hasten the French collapse. This act seals their fate in an irreversible way, for they not only commit their best troops, but do so along a single, predictable axis of attack. As the battle intensifies in the villages of Telnitz and Sokolnitz, the composition of the Allied army on the battlefield changes fatally. What was once a cohesive battle line controlled from a dominant position has transformed into a long, clumsy serpent of troops, its head locked in brutal combat in the south, and its body stretched and vulnerable along the western slopes of the Pratzen Heights. Their center, which should have been their anchor, their pivot point, and their strategic reserve, has been almost entirely emptied. The troops that should have been protecting the crucial high ground are now marching downhill, away from where the battle will truly be decided. The situation is a textbook example of how an army can be defeated by its own strategy. The Allied plan, though simple, might have worked against a lesser opponent. However, its rigid execution and its inability to adapt to unexpected resistance turned it into a death sentence. They were so obsessed with the idea of enveloping the French flank that they failed to realize that, in doing so, they were offering up their own center to be pierced and destroyed. The battlefield had become a reflection of their minds, focused on a single point. They were completely blind to the mortal threat that was brewing elsewhere. Napoleon, observing from his command post, watches his prediction materialize with terrifying precision. Every enemy movement is a confirmation of his reading of their intentions and their character. The patience he had shown in the early hours is now preparing to transform into action of devastating speed and violence. The sacrifice of Davout's men has served its purpose. They have absorbed the weight of the enemy's attack and have dragged the mass of the coalition army into the southern slaughterhouse. The center of the stage is now empty. The giant has exposed its heart, and the moment to plunge the sword is inexorably approaching. The giant's critical error was not a single decision, but a cascade of arrogant assumptions that culminated in a tactical disaster. By committing the entirety of their left wing and a large part of their center to the offensive against the French right flank, the Allied commanders had violated a fundamental principle of warfare. Never abandon the high ground and the center of your line unless you are absolutely certain of victory. Their plan had become completely irreversible. The troops now fighting in the southern valleys and streams were too far and too heavily engaged in combat to be able to withdraw and reoccupy the Pratzen Heights in time, even if they had perceived the imminent danger looming over them. This lack of strategic flexibility was a direct consequence of the divided command structure and Tsar Alexander's vanity. Whereas a pragmatic commander like Kutuzov might have kept a substantial reserve in the center, the Tsar's impatience for a crushing and glorious victory pushed all available units forward. The coalition army had become a spear without a shield, all its strength concentrated at the tip, leaving its core completely exposed. They were fighting the battle Napoleon wanted them to fight, not the battle that the conditions of the terrain and prudence dictated. Their fate was no longer in their own hands. They had willingly handed it over to their adversary. The irony of the situation was palpable. The numerically superior army had placed itself in a position of localized tactical inferiority. By concentrating their forces on a single point, they had created a fatal weakness in another. Napoleon, on the other hand, had used his numerically inferior army with lethal efficiency, keeping a hidden and concentrated strike force precisely at the point where it could inflict maximum damage. He was about to prove that in war, it is not the number of soldiers that matters, but where and when they are applied. The coalition's mistake was to believe that brute force could overcome tactical genius. As the Allied columns continued their advance southward, completely oblivious to the cataclysm being prepared, the stage for the battle's turning point was perfectly set. The center of the Allied army, now a thin line of troops scattered on the slopes of the plateau, was utterly incapable of resisting a concentrated assault. They were in the worst possible position, on low ground, disorganized by movement, and without a unified command. They had walked into the trap with astonishing naivety, and now, with their best troops entangled in a bloody struggle miles away, there was no one who could save them from the blow that was about to fall. It is 9 o'clock in Naes, the morning. At that precise instant, as if obeying a celestial command, a spectacular natural phenomenon changes the course of history. The winter sun, hitherto hidden, forcefully breaks through the thick blanket of fog. Its golden rays spill across the battlefield, dispelling the last shadows and revealing the scene with a brutal and dramatic clarity. For Napoleon, it is the signal he has been waiting for. The light illuminates the Pratzen Heights, showing exactly what he had anticipated. The strategic high ground is almost completely empty, abandoned by the enemy army in its mad dash to the south. The giant's heart is exposed and vulnerable, shining under the morning sun. With theatrical calm, Napoleon turns to his marshals, who watch him with an almost religious expectation. The tension in the French headquarters is broken by his words, uttered not as a command, but as a prophecy. "One sharp blow and the war is over," he declares with a chilling certainty. At that moment, he raises his hand and gives the order. It is the moment the entire Grande Armée has been waiting for. From their concealed position at the base of the plateau, Marshal Soult's IV Corps emerges from the last wisps of fog. 20,000 men, organized in massive assault columns, advance like a single arrow of blue steel, with bayonets fixed and drums beating a thundering rhythm. The French advance is a vision of terrifying power and discipline. In near total silence, broken only by the sound of thousands, of boots marching in unison and cries of "Vive l'Empereur," so soldiers begin the ascent of the Pratzen slopes. The few Allied units remaining on the heights see them appear like ghosts rising from the earth, a human tide surging relentlessly toward them. Shock and panic seize the enemy garrison. They are too few and too scattered to offer any effective resistance. In a matter of minutes, what should have been an impregnable fortress becomes the scene of a one-sided slaughter. The capture of the Pratzen Heights is the masterstroke, the turning point that breaks the back of the coalition army. By seizing the high ground in the center, Napoleon's army has achieved the unthinkable. It has split the enemy army into two completely isolated halves. The coalition's right wing to the north is cut off and unable to intervene, and the left wing, the massive force still fighting in the south, suddenly finds itself in a deadly trap, with Davout's troops blocking their front, and now Soult's corps occupying the heights to their rear, dominating them from above. The brilliance of Napoleon's plan is revealed in all its devastating magnitude. The psychological effect of this move is as catastrophic as the tactical one. The Allied commanders, who moments before were savoring victory, now watch in horror as the center of their universe collapses. The French standard waving from the summit of the Pratzen is a visual dagger in their hearts, an unequivocal declaration that they have been outmaneuvered, outwitted, and defeated. Panic begins to spread like wildfire through the Allied ranks. The battle plan, so clear and simple in the morning, has disintegrated into bloody chaos. The battle for Austerlitz is over. What follows now is simply the systematic annihilation of an army that has already been decapitated. Once the Pratzen Heights fell into French hands, the collapse of the coalition army was swift, brutal, and absolute. The Allied center, caught completely by surprise as it was ascending or on low ground, was mercilessly annihilated. Soult's divisions, now firmly established on the heights, acted as an anvil, while other French units, including Napoleon's Imperial Guard, were launched like a hammer upon the disorganized enemy formations. What had been an army became a mob of terrified men, running in all directions without leadership or cohesion. The Allied command completely disintegrated. Generals gave contradictory orders or simply tried to save their own lives, leaving their regiments to the mercy of the enemy. In the midst of the chaos, one force refused to yield: the Russian Imperial Guard. Led by Grand Duke Constantine, the Tsar's brother, these elite soldiers, the cream of the Russian army, launched a desperate and suicidal counterattack to try and retake the heights. For a moment, their courage and discipline seemed capable of working a miracle. They charged uphill with indomitable ferocity, pushing back some of the frontline French units. It was the most critical moment of the battle. Seeing the danger, Napoleon unleashed his own elite reserve, the cavalry of the Imperial Guard, led by Marshal Bessières. The clash of the two Imperial Guards was a titanic collision, a whirlwind of sabers, breastplates, and screams that became the epicenter of the battle. The charge of the French cavalry was decisive. Their cuirassiers and horse grenadiers, considered the best horsemen in the world, crashed into the Russian infantry, breaking their squares and sowing destruction. The Russian Imperial Guard, despite its bravery, was finally repulsed and decimated. With the defeat of their last hope, the morale of the rest of the Allied army evaporated completely. The collapse ceased to be a tactical process and became a primal instinct for survival. Discipline vanished, replaced by blind panic. Soldiers threw down their muskets, abandoned their colors, and ran for their lives, forming a terrified human mass fleeing the battlefield. The transition from a disciplined army to a panicked mob was terrifyingly swift. The units that had marched so proudly in the morning now dissolved into a sea of desperate individuals. The rout became contagious, spreading from regiment to regiment. Officers could no longer control their men. The order was inverted. Instead of leaders guiding the troops, it was now the fleeing troops who dragged their leaders with them. Tsar Alexander and Emperor Francis, witnessing the total catastrophe from a safe distance, joined the retreat, abandoning their shattered army to its fate and fleeing in disgrace from the field of their humiliation. The left wing of the Allied army, the very force that had begun the battle with such confidence, found itself in the most terrible trap of all. They were now completely surrounded. To their front, Davout's tenacious troops, who had resisted their assault for hours, now went on the offensive. To their rear and above them, from the Pratzen Heights, Solz, divisions and the French artillery rained down a storm of fire and lead. Their only apparent escape route was to the south, across a series of frozen lakes and marshes near the village of Satchan. Driven by panic and the relentless pressure of the French, thousands of Russian and Austrian soldiers rushed onto the frozen surface. It was then that Napoleon ordered the cruelest and most spectacular coup de grace of the battle. He saw the mass of men and horses fleeing across the ice and gave a chilling order to his artillerymen. They were not to aim at the men, but at the ice. The cannons of the Imperial Guard opened fire, and their heavy cannonballs smashed into the frozen surface. The ice cracked, then shattered with a thunderous sound, breaking open beneath the feet of the panicked soldiers. Men, horses, and cannons plunged into the frigid waters in a scene of indescribable horror. Thousands of soldiers drowned in a tomb of water and ice, their screams silenced by the mortal cold. The annihilation was complete. When the last gunshot faded on the frigid afternoon air, an eerie silence descended upon the battlefield of Austerlitz. The frantic rhythm of carnage gave way to a solemn and reflective stillness, broken only by the groans of thousands of wounded scattered across valleys and hills. The landscape, which at dawn was a pristine expanse of snow-covered fields, had been transformed into a vast canvas of human suffering. Mangled bodies lay in grotesque heaps. The white uniforms of the Austrians and the green of the Russians stained a dark red that was rapidly freezing upon the snow. Dead horses, overturned cannons, and thousands of abandoned muskets littered the ground, mute witnesses to the catastrophe that had taken place. The metallic smell of blood mixed with the smoke of gunpowder, creating a heavy, funereal atmosphere. The numbers, when they were finally tallied, quantified the almost inconceivable scale of the French victory and the Allied annihilation. The Grande Armée, despite having been at the center of fierce combat, had suffered around 9,000 casualties, killed and wounded. A terrible figure, but remarkably low considering the magnitude of the battle. On the coalition side, the figures were a catastrophe of biblical proportions. It is estimated they lost around 27,000 men, nearly a third of their entire army. Of these, thousands lay dead on the field, as many more were grievously wounded, and over 15,000 had been captured, along with 180 cannons and 50 battle standards, the honor of their regiments. The comparison of losses reveals the true nature of Napoleon's victory. It had not been merely a victory. It had been a tactical annihilation. The casualty ratio was devastating, a testament to the lethal efficiency with which he had closed his trap. The Allied army had not only been defeated, it had been shattered, dismembered, and humiliated. Its most prestigious regiments had been decimated, its command structure had evaporated in the rout, and its two emperors had witnessed firsthand the total disintegration of their military might. The defeat was so complete that it crushed not only their army, but also their will to continue fighting. In the hours and days that followed, French surgeons worked tirelessly, attending to friend and foe alike, while burial details began the grim task of digging mass graves. The spoils of war were immense. French soldiers scoured the field, collecting weapons, equipment, and the enemy standards, which would be sent to Paris to be displayed under triumphal arches. For the defeated commanders, the fate was ignominy. Tsar Alexander I and Emperor Francis II fled in complete disgrace, their mourning's arrogance turned into a bitter lesson in humility. They had arrived as the presumed saviors of Europe and left as fugitives, their imperial authority shattered by the genius of one man. The battlefield, after the din, became a place of profound melancholy. Napoleon rode over the ground, silently observing the terrible price of his most perfect victory. Despite the overwhelming triumph, the sight of the slaughter affected him. He showed clemency to many of the prisoners and ensured that the wounded, regardless of nationality, received care. The glory of Austerlitz, like all military glory, had been bought with an ocean of suffering. The field remained as a somber monument, a reminder that behind the strategic brilliance and the heroic legends, the fundamental reality of war is always the same: an immense and tragic harvest of death. The Battle of Austerlitz was not merely a military victory. It was a political earthquake that redrew the map of Europe and solidified Napoleon's dominion over the continent. Its echo resonated far beyond the blood-stained battlefield. The Third Coalition, which had seemed so formidable, was crushed in a single blow. Austria's will to fight was shattered, and Emperor Francis II was forced to sue for peace almost immediately. The result was the Treaty of Pressburg, a humiliating agreement that stripped Austria of vast and valuable territories, including Venetia and the Tyrol, and forced it to pay a massive indemnity. The power of the Habsburgs, which had dominated Central Europe for centuries, was drastically diminished. The most profound and lasting impact was the dissolution of a 1,000-year-old institution. A year after the battle, in 1806, pressured by Napoleon and with his imperial authority in tatters, Francis II abdicated as Holy Roman Emperor, bringing an end to a political entity that had existed in one form or another since the time of Charlemagne. Napoleon replaced it with his own creation, the Confederation of the Rhine, an alliance of German states under the protectorate of France. With this single move, he swept away a millennium of history and established himself as the undisputed master of Central Europe. Prussia, alarmed by the growing French power, would try to challenge him the following year, only to be annihilated at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt. Militarily, Austerlitz became the archetype of the Napoleonic battle, the tactical masterpiece that would be studied in military academies for the next 2 centuries. It became synonymous with a perfect victory, the supreme example of how deception, speed, and the concentration of force at the decisive point could overcome an overwhelming numerical superiority. The battle fully validated Napoleon's corps d'armée system, which allowed for a flexibility and speed of maneuver that no other European army could match. The strategy of luring the enemy into a predictable attack and then striking its weakened center became one of the hallmarks of Napoleonic genius. For Napoleon personally, Austerlitz was the pinnacle of his career, the moment his genius shone most brightly. The victory, achieved on the first anniversary of his coronation as emperor, was seen by many, including himself, as a sign of divine favor, a confirmation of his destiny. It cemented his reputation not only as a great general, but as the greatest military strategist in modern history. The name Austerlitz was seared into the consciousness of France and the world as the symbol of French imperial glory. Arches were built, bridges and stations were named in its honor, turning the memory of the battle into a foundational pillar of the Napoleonic myth. The Battle of Austerlitz thus became much more than a historical event. It transformed into a foundational legend of the Napoleonic Empire. It represented the triumph of skill over privilege, of genius over tradition, and of a revolutionary and energetic France over the old, decrepit monarchies of Europe. It was the day when Napoleon not only defeated 2 emperors, but also rewrote the rules of war and permanently altered the balance of power on the continent. The history of Europe, from that 2nd of December 1805, would follow the course. dictated by the will of the victor of Austerlitz, the man who had proven himself the true emperor of the battlefield. The legend of Austerlitz is etched into the annals of military history, but its most enduring and poetic detail is not a tactic or a statistic, but an image. The image of a radiant sun breaking through a veil of fog at the precise and decisive moment. This meteorological phenomenon became something far greater than a simple natural event. It was interpreted by the soldiers, by Napoleon himself, and by posterity as a sign of providence, a celestial intervention blessing the emperor's cause. In the army bulletins and in letters home, the veterans of the Grande Armée spoke not just of the battle, but of the miracle of the sun that had revealed the path to victory. This sun became a symbol as legendary as the battle itself, forever earning the name the Sun of Austerlitz. For Napoleon, it became his personal amulet, an omen of good fortune and a reminder of his moment of greatest genius. In later campaigns, in moments of doubt or difficulty, he would often look to the sky for his sun, invoking its memory as a source of inspiration and confidence. It became an integral part of his personal mythology, the idea that he was not just a master of war, but a man touched by destiny, capable of commanding not only men, but also the elements. The symbolism of the Sun of Austerlitz transcended Napoleon's lifetime. In French culture, it became a metaphor for a moment of brilliant and unexpected triumph, a stroke of genius that dispels confusion and doubt. Artists and writers, from Victor Hugo to Abel Gance, captured the image in their works, immortalizing it as the dramatic climax of the Napoleonic epic. The phrase, "It is the Sun of Austerlitz," entered the lexicon to describe any sudden stroke of luck or a brilliant revelation that changes the course of events. The sun ceased to be a mere celestial body and became the eternal emblem of the most perfect victory. And so, the battle that proved the mind is the deadliest weapon, the one won by a masterpiece of psychological deception, ends on a note of mysticism and wonder. The immortal legend of Austerlitz lies not only in the annihilation of an army or the dissolution of an empire. It resides in that magical moment when the fog parted and the light flooded the battlefield, as if the sky itself had decided to follow Napoleon's battle plan. It is the unforgettable reminder that on that cold December day, on the fields of Moravia, one man not only commanded an army to glory, but seemed for an instant to command the universe itself.